everybody. Thanks, Natalie, for the introduction. So I'm a postdoc here at Georgia Tech in the electrical engineering department. Recently finished up. This was like the cherry on top of my dissertation. So thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about my work, and I hope I can get you through the post-lunch slump. I'll try and be exciting and animated. So do I have to point it at it? Oh, this big green button. There are two green buttons. That's tricky. Okay, so three-letter words. Yeah, APTs. I really hate, oh, cool, this is nice. I really hate the word APTs. It's basically like whatever your particular company wants to call an APT threat is basically what it boils down to. But we wanted to think like what are some common things that everybody or more people would agree when they hear APT. Advanced is the word that I complain about the most, and you'll see why. So the first one is they're targeted. You're right. Advanced persistent threat. Maybe the T should be targeted. This makes a lot of sense, right? Commodity threats. I can make more money if my botnet is bigger, and I can send out more spam or do more click fraud or whatever. But an APT has a more focused purpose, and this tends to be either geopolitical in nature or trying to steal intellectual property, things of this nature. The infections also tend to be persistent and last for years. A lot of other common off-the-shelf malicious stuff that we see, really, if I'm stealing credit card numbers and bank credentials, I need to be on your box for a couple of minutes and then I can leave, and it doesn't really matter. But to do an APT, or at least what people consider to be APTs, they tend to last much longer. So persistent, this is a word I can agree with. They tend to be sponsored by nation states, large organizations, things of this nature, rather than some guy in Ukraine that's trying to make some extra cash on the side. As I said earlier, they're trying to perform surveillance or steal intellectual property. Now, the tricky thing with all of these is a lot of them are centered around the intent of the attack, which if you're like me and you like to use statistics and statistical modeling, this is hard to represent in numbers. So we need to start thinking, well, what are other ways that we could try and represent this threat in a way to build some sort of automated detection for it? So other things that I identified from basically just reading any report that said APT on it and then listed what they found doing their postmortem, I found a few things in common that might lead towards robust features for detection. So one of the interesting ones was a lot of them use commodity malware. I was in one of the lunch talks and he was doing some like hunting, I think Doug, I don't remember exactly, but he was looking at like poison ivy command and control. Poison ivy is this common malware toolkit that you can use. You can use it for APTs, or you could use it for normal malware infection. So the advanced part, I think, is one of the big misconceptions when it comes to APT. Everyone thinks APT, it's like Stuxnet, for example. Very advanced, using a lot of 0 days, all this kind of stuff. That's not necessarily true. And by and large, it's completely untrue. All I need is a rat. I'm in your box, I'm in your network, I'm going to start digging around for things that I care about. So this is not going to be a strong feature. But I show in some results that this is kind of nice. A lot of them use domain names. Domain names work, they're cheap, they're easy. A lot of them, and this was probably one of the more interesting things, is that they rely on compromised machines for infrastructure. Now, the reason is kind of interesting, and it's going back to the purpose of APT threats, where there are going to be geopolitical concerns potentially for identifying this threat. So I want to basically not have any sort of, I want to have plausible deniability, right? So if I have a bunch of compromised boxes, I'm not paying some host, some bulletproof host somewhere to provide my command and control infrastructure. I can kind of just put my hands up and be like, no, it's not me. And this leaves a very interesting signal that we can detect with large network analysis. And finally, a lot of them have this interesting sleepy command and control domain names, where basically when I'm not using it as an attacker, I change the domain names for my command and control to resolve to 0000 or localhost, because what this actively does is when I'm doing my regular pinging back to try and reach out to the CNC, if it's localhost, I don't cross the network edge. So I can maintain a very, very low profile. This is like the low and slow kind of idea, right? So we use, I keep hitting the wrong button. So let me give you some examples of some APT infrastructure we found in the wild. So, oh, this all went at once. Okay, so on the left here we have northeasternroof.com. This is some roofing company in New England somewhere. It resolves to a handful of IP addresses. The one in the middle is the one it primarily used. Now, if you look at other domain names that resolve to, you see this whole host of domains with innocuous child labels, sys, SSA, pop, info, news, things of that nature. And then they resolve to a wide swath of IPs all over the place. Going back to my earlier point, if you're relying on compromised infrastructure, you don't get to pick where that is. You're basically relying on, well, what's the vulnerability du jour, where can I find it, and that's the machine that I'm going to be using for my infrastructure. Similarly, if that gets cleaned up, I lose my infrastructure, right? So you got to make up for that in numbers. So you end up seeing quite a few of them. Note that they're not located near each other, near in the IP distance kind of sense. And then also we see our friends here, the non-routable IP 0000 and localhost, indicating this sleepy behavior I discussed earlier. So what we do in this talk is we focus on identifying this subset of APT we call manual APTs, where there's this on and off behavior. We've actually seen like some logs based on resolution patterns where it's clear that someone like logs into the admin panel on GoDaddy, changes the IP address, does a handful of malicious activity, and then turns it back on immediately. And we're talking on the order of minutes here. So you really need large-scale analysis and like large passive DNS data, basically historic resolutions from a large network. We see that they're primarily DNS-based. Like I said, they use compromised machines, and we see that this is commonly used by PRC-sponsored threats, so think like Mandiant APT1 report, things of that nature. So the feature set that we use is in front of you. The on and off behavior, as I mentioned before, we're basically looking for distributions of contiguous legitimate resolutions and contiguous resolutions to non-routable IP space. Also this infrastructure distribution. So for a given domain name, since it's relying on compromised infrastructure, we expect it to be on more IPs than we would normally see, basically, and in different autonomous systems, different BGP prefixes, different country codes, et cetera. Now we also, since it's targeted in nature, we want to get some idea of the client lookup behavior. We would expect an APT threat to be more focused. And the way we quantify more focused is the data set that we had it separated into internet service provider level customers and enterprise level customers. So we would expect a greater proportion of these resolutions to be occurring in enterprise customers and fewer in ISPs. And then also that, again, the IP distribution to be more focused in nature. The next batch of features we have are the DNS zone features. These are a little bit weaker, but we found in practice they tend to work fairly well. So dynamic DNS, these are common because it's cheap, or well, it's free, basically. So you can get domain names. There's also less of a kind of attribution trail. There's no equivalent of whois for dynamic DNS. So in this case, you can, more plausible deniability is always good if you're an APT actor. And then also, from the previous example I showed, there were a couple of effective second-level domains, or the registerable portion that you pay for. And then under that, you see multiple child labels. And what we saw in practice is they tend to use this for like cataloging purposes. So you would see something that said like BAE. And I wonder, I'm sure some of you are familiar with BAE, or if there were other ones we saw that were like DHS or DOD. These are basically cataloging for the attackers. So they're like, I know that this third level label is focused on this particular campaign. And then we also look at the lifetime distribution between the registerable part of the domain name and the IP infrastructure that it resolves to. And this was basically, we noticed a lot of the false positives we were getting were common scam or phishing or like a lot of like SEO stuff to pump up domains so you can kind of get drive-by download clicks or something like that, because they tend to be similarly dispersed and also share infrastructure with legitimate domain names. So what we see is that scam domains tend to be very transient, APTs last longer than that, and then usually the benign domain lasts even longer than that. But there's a difference between this of the domain names on this particular compromised infrastructure. So here's a high-level overview of how this system works, and really what matters are like three chunks. On the left, we do all this data collection, right? So this is where we're collecting large-scale passive DNS in order to identify these relationships over time. BGP announcements, so we can say things like, well, this set of IPs are in 4 different autonomous systems, for example. And then also a knowledge base, basically starting from the series of reports we have. Here are indicators of compromise that we know are associated with an APT threat. And we'll use this to build our models. In the middle part here, we extract the features I described before and then start classifying resource records as we see them. And then we have a third part that clusters these results. And this is for two reasons. The first is, as I mentioned before, we're dealing with compromised infrastructure here. So we expect to see a mixture of both benign and APT-related domains. So we need some way of intelligently separating these. And second, for those who have done kind of like threat research or threat investigations, the more contextual information you have, the easier it is to make a classification as to did the system work or did it not work. So what we found in these cases, since we're giving as output domain names, the more domain names you give that you're confident are related to a particular threat, the easier it is to say, yes, I'm confident that this is related to this particular APT. And we do some nice little weighting. Oh no, this is messed up. Well, I apologize. Let's see, what's going to be the easiest way to do it? I'll just skip it for now. Yeah, that's probably not that important. I can explain it in words. That'll be a lot easier in all honesty. So the clustering technique that we use, we basically take, here are all the domain names we've identified, and here are all the IPs that we've identified that resolve. And this is like the contiguous infrastructure. And we build a bipartite graph. This can be represented as a matrix, and now there's a lot of fun math that we can throw at it to solve this problem. We use there's a singular value decomposition. It's a spectral method that allows us to take a really, really big matrix and make it a much smaller matrix, which we can then cluster and then say, this infrastructure or these domain names are highly related to this infrastructure, to then give reports to threat analysts to say, this must be an APT. So let's talk about the experiments. This is the more fun stuff, to be honest. So first, we do what is commonly called model selection in the machine learning community, which is basically just to say, OK, here's my set of features. Here's my set of ground truth. Can I reliably classify the things I know accurately? And the idea here is if it works on our ground truth data set, it should hopefully work in the real world. This doesn't always work in practice, but it's a good first step to make sure you're not kind of barking up the wrong tree. Second, I was working closely with an enterprise here at Damballa to expand their APT coverage. So I talk about how we went from the set of APTs that we knew about, used this tool to then grow that understanding. And second, thankfully, the way I constructed this made it easy to scale quite rapidly. So from all the visibility we had in IPv4 and the DNS resolutions there, we build features and model and classify all of IPv4, and then start looking at some very high confidence clusters of APTs to identify some interesting activity. So let's go through those. So this is, if anyone's seen this plot here on the left, this is called an ROC curve. What matters is, you see the blue line, that means we're doing great. Basically, this means we can have, for a very high true positive rate, we minimize the false positive rate. And this is kind of going back, if I'm giving hundreds and hundreds of false positives a day, no one's going to use my tool, nobody cares, we'll move on. This basically shows that the random forest model was the one that was the most successful. This makes a lot of sense given the non-linearity of some of the features. Basically, you couldn't cut a single feature in this half is APT and this half is not APT without considering the other features. They're strongly dependent upon each other. So this shows, hey, we have a pretty good, man, I feel bad, sorry guys. Let's just skip to the, I can go back here. Yeah. So basically, this mess of tables is a variety of classifications that we made that were fairly successful. This one in the middle here, phdns01.com, this is an example where the infrastructure was rather small and focused. A lot of the time, you see things a little bit more all over the place. The one behind it that has unknown APT operators, and then Night Dragon, Comment Crew, and Hydra. This is an example of a false positive where, because of the existence of a sinkhole, we were mistaken into believing that a handful of domain names were related to each other. And then the one behind that you can't really see, unfortunately, all of the domain names are under the registerable domain clawsnare.com. And we notice at the very bottom here, there are two of these that we know are associated with Comment Crew. All the remaining ones are unknown. And this is an example of where this contextual information is very helpful. You see the domain name, they have a very similar structure in how they're labeled, and we have one or two of them already labeled in our data set. So it becomes very easy for an analyst to look at it and go, oh yes, these must be related. Let me check this box and add it into our product. So one of the interesting things about the feature set that I used is it takes a while for it to, I guess, mature or ripen. If we're waiting to see heavy distribution of IPs, we need to wait for a while for the infrastructure to be moving. So one of the experiments we ran was to basically say, how long do we need to wait for these features to present themselves in order to get decent classification results? And what we see basically on the month 4 here, the blue line at the top represents the true positive rate of the random forest classifier, and the bottom line represents the false positive rate. And we see it's maximized on the top and it's minimized at the bottom at around the 4-month rank, or the 4-month point. So we need to wait about 4 months. Now you might be saying, oh, that's kind of a long time. But given the time frame that APTs generally operate on, it's quite a bit better than the state of the art. So like ComFu Masters was a particular one that took about 7 years to discover. I'd say 4 months is probably better than 7 years, at least according to myself. And in other examples, the claw snare one I showed you before, they tend to last on average about a year, some of them for thousands of days. So if we're able to get into a network and say on the order of months that we can pretty accurately model these, that's a good sign. I mentioned earlier that malware was a pretty bad feature in that you can really use any kind of malware that you care about. Anything that provides rat-like functionality, you can use that in your APT threat. And what we see from an earlier, this is much before we did like the IPv4 modeling, when we looked at the malware families that were associated with the domain names we were classifying, we kept seeing things generic Trojan, generic backdoor, generic downloader, poison ivy. If you're relying on these in order to do your classification, especially in a system like this, you're going to get a lot of false positives, is basically what it boils down to. But we found this to be comforting because it kind of backed up our point where it's like, oh, use the network data instead, don't rely on the malware. That can be a red herring at times. So let's jump into the IPv4 experiment because this is the fun one. So basically, well, like I said, we just generate features for all of IPv4, all the domain names we see resolving there. There's some filtering and cutoff, so we don't include things that we obviously know are good, like google.com. So the numbers might seem lower for IPv4, but we get about 300 million resource records. I get about 1 million clusters from these results. And if we look at the average score, where 0 is my classifier is confident it's not an APT, and 1 it's confident it is an APT, we see hundreds of them only that are above an 80% likelihood of being associated with APT infrastructure. So this is nice already, right? We're not saying that the whole internet is an APT. That's probably a good first bar to clear. Now there were a lot of false positives in here, but I'm going to show a couple of examples of what we found. And I found in practice, it's pretty easy to spot when the classifier messes up and we get a false positive. It's much harder to spot successes without basically having full PCAPs, having binaries, things of this nature. And then given the vagueness of the term APT, really it's like if I say it's an APT, that's probably sufficient. I don't know. It turns into one of these games where it's like, is it really that case? So I'll talk about a couple of examples here. This is just to show we don't classify the internet as an APT. We see it's mostly not APT. That's good, thumbs up, right? So here's the first one. And this is an example of what I believe are false positives that are like scam infrastructure stuff. You Google for this, you just kind of see weird, a lot of hits on websites. I think this is used for like scam SEO stuff. And it probably is too noisy both on like Google search results to be an APT. When you really find one, you search for it and there's like no results, basically. Here's an example. The domain names are all Kaspersky. I'm sure you're familiar with Kaspersky. This is a common technique to lay low. If you see this in logs, you'd be like, oh, it's antivirus, no big deal. You do whois lookups, it's privacy guarded. If you look for this, you end up finding someone claimed it's a targeted malware calling home. Here's another example, trying to masquerade as live.org, like Microsoft, with a 1 instead of an L. Once again, we see all these very, innocuous looking third level labels. Music, down, soft, chat. Update's a pretty common one. If you can pretend to be updates, that looks nice. And this is another one. You Google, you see no virus total links. You see the only things that resolve there are like examples of resolution behavior. This domain name was registered on this date, things of that nature. Digging in a little bit more, you see that this was actually sinkholed by a Canadian software company, and it was known to be affiliated with the APT Comment Crew group. Here's another example that was confirmed in some earlier reports, but we found that the domain names are no longer active. However, they shared infrastructure with yet another APT targeting Indian research labs. Again, we see Gov, HQR support, things like that, trying to be innocuous. I see I'm running a little bit out of time, but I'm almost done, so that's good. This is one that was in an Usenix paper. Basically, we found that despite their claims, the infrastructure was still resolving, had a whole host of additional domain names. And my personal favorite is this one that we haven't seen a report claiming that it's an APT, but it looks and smells like one for all intents and purposes. We see Office updates here, pretending again to be some sort of standard update procedure stuff, and then a lot of things indicating East Asian countries or in the subcontinent. So India, Hanoi, Myanmar, Saigon. And one of the search, if you just search for all these domain names, you don't find a single indicator that, yes, this is an APT. But one of them was talking about an infection that was related to a PDF titled Letter to President Obama regarding his planned visit to Burma, which I have right here. So if you get this PDF in your email, I'd recommend not opening it. It's probably not good. Here's some like PowerPoint slides that were related to it. It looks really nice. Yeah, so that's all the time I have. So thanks for listening. I'd love to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Did you notice any correlations between registrars, anonymity, and the malicious behavior?
Like particular registrars?
Right.
Yeah, you tend to see a handful used over and over and over again. BizCN is a pretty popular one. Again, if you're going over with the PRC sponsored threats. Internet BS is another one that we see all the time. I think it could be used as a feature for detection. Collecting whose information is kind of a pain in the ass, but you'd be able to get that from name server records. I could see that as being very, very useful. Another interesting thing you see with regard to name server records is it tends to be another way of linking threats and infrastructure together. So it's not something we used here, but it's actually something we're actively using for other projects for things like that. So yeah. I hope I didn't put all you to sleep. Excuse me. Good, he's awake. All right, excellent, excellent. I wonder if I had any other slides. I think that's all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much. That was totally awesome. And I'm going to tell you why I think, well, yeah, we need clapping first, clapping first. So, as a mathematician, I was getting so excited. You probably didn't notice me over there. I was like, it's graphs. Oh my gosh, she's talking about the math.
Yeah, oh yeah. Math. We love math.
It probably worried a couple people out there, because the math can be scary. But
I try and keep it light on the math.
We totally understand. Math really rules the world, and it would solve all these problems out here if only
it's all
we had
some
the
of
math.
them, at least.
The important ones. So I do want to thank so much for your time coming out here because analyze, hunt, defend. The analyze piece is really important. Sometimes we get so busy thinking about all the cool, sexy things we can do on the offensive side, and we're like, oh, the defense. But the reason we're successful either doing offense or defense is because there's some analysis behind it all to help guide us in what we're doing. So truly awesome work you're doing. Very exciting. I want to thank you so very much. And here's your official black badge of awesomeness.
I'm excited. I like this a lot.
So I have the directions down there so I can tell you all about it.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you.